Welcome back, everybody. We're going to look at another weapons video from Forgotten Weapons. This one is over the Swedish M41B. Um, I don't know a ton about different sniper rifles of World War II. I know a bit about kind of predecessor snipers from previous generations. Basically, rifles that used with a particular type of ammo were able to be used pretty effectively as snipers, but obviously at relatively short ranges, certainly in comparison to something like today. Um, where and we've looked at the Winter War, we've looked at Simo and what he did, and I've talked about the type of firearm that he used. Before we jump into it, though, I asked in the last video about the Swedish economy, and from some of the responses that I got, I'm actually looking at a couple of different videos right now that are related to the Swedish economy. They were sent to me in response, but in general, the responses I got were pretty similar to the US. And essentially, I'm not sure about Sweden specifically. I heard some people saying something along the same lines, but I'll speak strictly for the US because that's the economics I know. The US, in leading up to 2008 and after 2008, they made money really cheap. They lowered interest rates, they did quantitative easing, which is just kind of flooding the system with liquidity. And because of that, it was cheap to borrow money. And when it's cheap to borrow money, it makes sense to borrow in order to invest. The whole idea being that the cap rates that, the ROI that you could get on an investment would be worth it if the money you're borrowing with is very cheap. So that's what everybody did. I mean, in investing, especially in housing, just exploded. So all of this newfound kind of inflation in the real economy, if you looked at asset prices here around the US for the past decade almost, you saw that inflation happening. You saw it in the stock market, you saw it in housing, you saw it in assets, but it had not come over into the real economy until very recently, specifically with all of the COVID stuff. Um, and in the situation that the US is in right now, they're kind of up between a rock and a hard place because if if they go with the idea that inflation will fix itself and it doesn't, they will totally lose the bond market, which means they basically will lose their currency. Okay. That could have some pretty dramatic impacts on the world at large if the dollar were to, you know, go under. And so that's obviously not going to happen. They won't. They won't do that, right? The other kind of way to handle it is to try to crush inflation so that you keep the value of the dollar at least from the way that the world sees the value of the dollar. Um, but in doing so, probably put the country into a pretty dramatic recession. This is the route they seem to have chosen. The talk has been that they can sidestep a really bad recession. I personally don't see it. I think a pretty bad recession is probably on the horizon. Housing prices have flipped. They've already topped out. Now they're starting to come down in most places across the country. Asset prices in the stock market and bond market have come down. Everything is kind of starting to come down. And to be honest, it's kind of our own fault. Like we sort of inflated these bubbles by making it extremely cheap to borrow, and then now we have bubbles. So if anything happens, the bubbles pop and everything has to come down dramatically. So that's kind of the situation that the US is in. Again, I think that's similar to the situation that Sweden is in, although I'm not sure about the recession or the idea of an upcoming recession specifically. But if you have anything else that you want to add to it with regards to the Swedish economy, let me know. Because, like I said, I love economics. I'm all in on it. Historical economies is something that I am incredibly fascinated with as far as studying history. So, um, Yeah, I just really love that stuff. I've got a couple of Swedish economy videos that I'm currently trying to work my way through to kind of get a better understanding of it. But I just kind of would like, you know, I just want to know what everybody thinks. I want to know where everybody sees this going. If you believe it's happenstance, if it's bad luck because of COVID, or if some bad decisions have led everything here. How Europe or Sweden specifically is going to handle the stuff with Russia and Ukraine and energy prices and all that. But yeah, that's totally beside the point. So we can go ahead and jump in. The Swedish M41B, let's get into it.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company where we are taking a look at what is arguably the best Mauser sniper rifle ever made, and that is the Swedish M41B. Now we'll get to the B as opposed to just the M41 in due course, but let's start at the beginning, which would be Sweden in 1940. They're sitting there being all cool and they realize that off to one side they've got a bunch of Finns who are busy trying to fight off the Russians, and on the other side they've got a bunch of Norwegians who are busy trying to fight off the Germans. And this is looking like a rather dangerous world to be in. And Sweden realizes that while it has a very nice service rifle in the Swedish Mauser, the M94 and the M96 Mausers, they actually don't have any scoped rifles. They have no sniper rifle at all.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. Regardless of how you feel about Sweden's general handling of World War II, they're trying to keep their head above water. They're in between a massive rock and a hard place between the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, and so they're maneuvering in a way where they're trying to stay out of war from either side, and that's really precarious whenever Germany and the Soviet Union have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That is a very precarious situation for all of the Nordic countries, really for the whole world. But if you're Sweden, you still have to, as much as you're trying to avoid war, you still have to kind of take some steps to somewhat be prepared if it were to come. You can't just kind of bury your head in the sand and say, okay, well, we're doing everything we can so war won't hit. It still may come, and you may not really have a choice in it. So,
and the Finns in particular are making pretty good use of this sort of thing. And the Swedes decide that they really probably ought to get something along these lines. So in 1940, they put together a program pretty quickly to get themselves a scoped rifle. And they actually do it by contracting with Germany for their optics and mounts. They don't really figure they have time to develop something internally and build it all. And Germany's got a pretty good setup already going. So the Swedes basically contract to purchase German-style short-rail Mauser scope mounts and optics. They get what is specifically a 4-power AJAC, that's short for Adolf Jachenroll, German optics company that makes the scope. They get this scope, really a quite nice scope. The reticle is just a basic German post, so you've got a pretty thick horizontal line, and then you've got a pretty thick center line with a little point on it. That's all you need there. We'll get into the details of the scope when we take a closer look. What's more relevant is from 1941 to 1943, the Swedes go ahead and they make they make 2,000 to 3,000 of these with these nice German scopes. And then it's 1943, and the Germans are looking at their own situation and going, why are we getting rid of our scope mounts? We kind of need that stuff. We're going to cut off Sweden. So you're on your own. We're using all of our scope mounts ourselves now. And the Swedes were left with, well, they wanted more rifles. So what they ended up doing was using a domestically produced optic instead, a 3-power scope from a company called AGA. And there was a 1942 pattern that kind of had some issues, wasn't the greatest, it wasn't perfectly well sealed against moisture, so they'd kind of get foggy sometimes. They improved that in 1944 with a 1944 pattern AGA scope. And the Swedes went ahead and finished out their production using those. All of these were made during World War II, and in total they made, I think, 5,300 of them. So really not all that many. They were issued out, 6 per company, became a standard part of Swedish infantry armament. Never actually had to be used in service, but magnificent rifles. Then, following up on that, in 1955, the Swedes came back and decided it was time to kind of rebuild all these things. They weren't at war anymore. They didn't really like having 3 separate types of scopes involved. And the Swedish AGA scopes really just weren't up to the quality of the Ajax that they really preferred to use. So in 1955, they set up a program and rebuilt basically all of the rifles, acquiring more Ajax scopes at this point after the war to make up for the ones that they didn't have. None of the 1942 scopes survived the refurb process. They were all ditched. A very small number of the 1944 Swedish scopes made it onto 41B refurbished rifles, but the vast, vast majority are these 4-power German Ajax scopes. At the same time, they made a few updates to the mounting system, which in fact we should go ahead and take a look at. Now, it's not uncommon to see like a release lever on a scope mount like this. Usually what this is a locking lever, and one would normally expect to see it kind of in the horizontal position. You put the scope on and then you lock it down. Well, the lever on these Swedish snipers works in a completely different way. This is actually a release lever. So it's there to give you some leverage to cam the scope off of its base. So if I push this backwards, it's going to run until it hits that pin. It's going to push the scope back, and it allows me to easily remove the scope from its mounting rail. The way that actually works is in conjunction with this pin. When I put the scope on, there's a little notch here in the lever that lines up with that pin.
Yep.
And right there, that pin goes into the lever, and if I push the lever forward, it locks it in place. Now, one of the original problems with this system is that people would pull too hard on the lever, and they'd kind of crank this thing too far forward to the point that it was really hard to get it back off. So one of the modifications they made with the 41B overhaul and upgrade is to add this set screw on the front. And this just acts as a stop.
Yeah, so these are actually, these like small quirks of different weapons, systems and different firearms are actually really interesting to me. Somebody in the comments of the last video talked about, God, what was it? I've been looking at so many different weapons lately. I've got all this different stuff going through my head. I think it was the notch that held in the bolt, and talked about how it was actually pretty easy to get the notch down and to remove the bolt, to the point that people could be walking, marching, running with the rifle and look up and their bolt just be gone. And I responded in the comment like, I can't imagine even being in training, going through this huge long march, getting to the end and realizing your rifle no longer has a bolt in it. It's gone. You've gone 20 miles. There's no telling where it is. And you just now have a really sophisticated and beautiful looking club in your hands, basically. So these like small little, almost like what they learned with time, the small little changes they had to tweak because of use of them are super interesting to me.
Scope hits this screw and stops there, no matter how hard you're pushing on this lever. The mounts were not actually originally numbered. They figured the scope mount's not coming off, so why bother serializing it? However, the scope mount actually is mounted directly over the part of the receiver where the original serial number was. So that may have been a little bit awkward. At any rate, in 55, when they upgraded these, they went ahead and put the rifle's serial number on all of the scope bases. Now, when they originally did this, you'll see this looks like it's missing some parts. When they originally did this, they had 2 pins, which are still in here. You can just kind of, let's see, there's one and there's one. And then 3 screws that hold this scope mounting rail into the receiver. This is similar to how the Germans did them. And even with all of that, they found that the screws could come loose. So they put second holes in, and they actually put in locking screws with a little semicircular cutout. You've probably seen that on some German rifles. And those locking screws held the main screws in place. Well, when they updated these in 55, they left that out, and instead they just peened the main screws into those holes. So you can see how they've done that. That prevents those screws from rotating. It means you don't have extra little locking screws that are now liable to get loose and fall out. The scope itself is, of course, a 4-power, has a 38 millimeter ocular lens and a 44 millimeter
Yeah, it's pretty.
objective lens. So on the large side for a World War II era scope, 4-power magnification was pretty much common. Most people in World War II were using either 3 or 4-power or somewhere in between. There is a BDC up here. This allows you to adjust for range out to 800 meters. And as you turn this, it simply elevates or drops the reticle in the scope. So it's not actually moving the scope body at all, it's just moving the reticle within. Also has an adjustable focus knob here. And that's pretty much it. No other buttons or widgets that you need to play with on the scope. When they originally built these, they took rifles that were known accurate rifles, particularly accurate rifles, that were already in service. These were not brand new factory-made guns. They were existing rifles that were converted at the Carl Gustaf's plant by adding these scope mount rails and scopes.
You have certain rifles that they're really known to be accurate at long distance, especially if they're using a particular type of ammunition. And different countries kind of had their own different types of ammunition for different rifles that worked best. But in a lot of cases, this is what eventually became kind of the initial sniper rifles, were these just regular typical rifles that you put a scope on. We talked about Simo earlier in the Winter War. He's obviously well known for not using optics at all. That was not his. He liked the what was it? The dog ears, I think, was what he was using, or what was on his rifle. So yeah, this is pretty common for this time period, just to have a typical rifle that's used at different levels in the military. It works better at long range. It's accurate at longer range. Although 800 meters is it said that the optics for this could be set for 800 meters. That's, for this time period, that's a long way.
So they just took the guns they already knew were pretty good. As a result, there is no specific serial number range for the Swedish snipers. And in fact, you will find them with markings from all 3 manufacturers, Carl Gustaf's, Husqvarna, and Mauser, and over a fairly wide range of dates. This one happens to be a 1903 Carl Gustaf. One of the other things they did in 55 at the upgrade program was they replaced the rear iron sights on these rifles with a much more fine-tunable rear sight, and it's this dial style of sight. So you've got notches there for every 25 yards from 100 out to, looks like 600, right there. The way this works is that it's simply running a screw down into the bottom of the rear sight to push this thing up or let it down. These rifles have really nice triggers and are perfectly usable with the iron sights should you not want to use the scope or should anything happen to the scope. So they made a point that you can pull the scope off and still use it really well. I suppose there might be a good excuse to do that should you actually get into combat. If you were operating at relatively short ranges, perhaps, didn't want the enemy to recognize that you were a sniper, something along those lines. I guess I should also point out here that this one has this cool little sheet metal sight hood on it as well. Front sight is a nice squared off post. Swedes knew how to do accurate rifles, that's for sure. It wasn't actually until 1991 that these were completely taken out of service in Sweden. And it should say something about the role that they were playing, that when they were taken out of service, they were ultimately replaced by the HK PSG-1, also a reasonably well-renowned precision rifle. As they were being surplused, this happened in stages. A lot of them were actually surplused into Canada and Europe before 1986, because until 86, it was not legal to import this sort of rifle into the United States. When that changed in 86, a lot of them started coming into the US. And I believe the very last batch of them was surplused in 1996 to an American company called Samco. So we have a fair number of them here in the US. They're really kind of underappreciated rifles because, well, probably because Sweden was never really in a stand-up infantry fight during World War II. That doesn't change the fact that these are really nice sniper rifles, really nice precision rifles, and will shoot, I suspect, just as well today as they did throughout their entire military service lives. Sweden used nice, clean ammo. These weren't ever abused in combat, and they're great shooting guns. So anyway, if you would like more information about this one in particular, Rock Island's catalog page has everything you might want to know about it. Pictures, description, price estimate, all that sort of stuff. You can get there by way of Forgotten Weapons, which is linked in the description text below. Thanks for watching.
Another great video by Forgotten Weapons. I talk about it every time we do one. They do well with these, and I really like them. So, yeah, that's the Swedish M41B, best sniper rifle of World War II. I'm going to be at my parents' for over the Christmas break. I'm going down there for a handful of days. I'm thinking about doing a video while I'm there over, well, over some of the firearms that we have out there. You know, they live out in the country. They are rural folk. And so I've just thought about kind of doing a little bit of show and tell to show kind of what's common for rural Texas, what's common for the type of firearms that people would own out here. So I'm thinking I'm probably gonna do that. I go down there on, I think, the 23rd, so sometime between then and like the 26th, 27th, I'm gonna try to record that video. I've also got the fighter pilot series that I'm gonna get another video out for soon. And the next episode of the If the War Came series is being translated as we speak. So all of that will be happening. I'm going to try to find a video that is specific to Christmas, whether it's the famous Christmas truce of World War I or something like that, to do as kind of a quote unquote like Christmas video. So that stuff will be coming soon. Be on the lookout, and I will see you all next time.